silent giant rancher hadn't spoken to a woman in 20 years, until 3 hungry girls knocked on his barn door. Chapter 1. The wind carried a dry whistle across the endless Montana plains, rattling the loose boards of the old barn and tugging at the faded curtains of the stone ranch house. From a distance, the property looked as lifeless as the man who lived there, a giant of a figure known only as Elias Boone, the silent rancher. For 20 years, the townsfolk whispered about him. They said he hadn't spoken to a woman since the day his bride-to-be died on the trail, leaving him a hollow shell. Some called him cursed, others dangerous. His silence was his fortress, and his size, towering broad-shouldered, with hands big enough to bend steel, kept strangers at bay. Yet every morning, before the sun cleared the ridges, Elias was out with his cattle, working the land with a patience only solitude could breed. He hadn't felt a soft hand on his cheek in 2 decades. He hadn't allowed a woman's voice to stir his heart since the day he buried his fiancée beneath the cottonwoods by the creek. But fate, cruel and strange, has a way of knocking when a man least expects it. And that knock came one cold evening at his barn door. Elias had just set down a heavy pail of milk when he heard it, 3 sharp raps against the old wood. He froze, his chest tightening. No one ever came here. Not neighbors, not drifters, not even the store boy who sometimes dropped his supplies. The knock came again, followed by a small, timid voice. "Mr. Please, we're hungry." Elias's brow furrowed. He set the pail aside, the muscles in his arms flexing as he unlatched the barn door. When it swung open, the twilight spilled across 3 figures huddled close together. 3 girls. The oldest couldn't have been more than 17, her dark hair tangled but her chin lifted with stubborn pride. Beside her stood a younger sister, perhaps 12, clutching a worn shawl around her thin shoulders. The youngest, a child of 7, hid behind them, her big eyes wide with both fear and hope. They looked starved, their cheeks hollow, their dresses patched and torn. Elias grunted, his deep voice unused, gravelly. "What is this?" The eldest girl straightened, squaring her shoulders though her lips trembled. We don't mean no harm, sir. We been walkin' near 2 days. Mama and Papa, they're gone. We just need a little food. Maybe some milk. We saw your cows." Her words hung in the cold air, trembling like the lantern flame by the barn door. Elias's chest tightened. He hadn't spoken more than a handful of words to anyone in years, but he found himself answering, slow and rough. "You came here." "Yes, sir," she whispered. "We didn't know where else to go." The silence between them stretched. The girls shivered in the wind. Elias Boone, giant, feared, and silent, stood staring at them, his heart stirring in ways he thought had died long ago. He didn't invite people into his home. He didn't let anyone cross his gates. Yet, something in the desperation of those 3 girls broke through the iron walls around his soul. Wordlessly, he turned, gesturing with a hand bigger than the eldest girl's face. "Come." They followed, their small footsteps crunching against the frostbitten earth, until he opened the barn wider. Warmth and the smell of hay wrapped around them. The youngest girl gasped softly at the sight of calves in the stalls, their soft eyes blinking curiously. Elias pulled out 3 tin cups, filled them with fresh milk, and handed them over. The girls drank like they hadn't tasted food in days. The youngest's hands shook, milk dribbling down her chin, but she smiled through it. Elias's throat tightened at the sight. He turned away, busying himself with the cows, but his mind was restless. When the cups were empty, the eldest set hers down carefully. "Thank you, sir. We'll go now." Elias's head whipped around, his voice low but firm. "Go? To where?" She hesitated, her eyes flashing with both defiance and fear. We'll manage." He studied her. The way her hands trembled told a different story. The way her little sisters clung to her skirt told him everything. Elias Boone had sworn never to let another soul into his heart. But tonight, as the cold deepened and the girls shifted uncertainly at his barn door, something inside him cracked. "No," his voice rumbled like distant thunder. "You'll stay inside." The girls blinked up at him, startled. The eldest whispered, Why would you help us?" Elias turned away, his jaw tightening. Words never came easy. But in that moment, one truth pushed past his silence. "'Cause I ain't lettin' you freeze." The ranch house was sparse but solid, built of stone and timber. Elias hadn't had company in decades. The hearth was cold most nights. He preferred the chill, but tonight he lit a fire, its glow filling the room with warmth that had long been absent. The girls sat near it, their faces softening in the light. The youngest soon dozed off, curled up against her sister. The eldest, though, kept her gaze on Elias, studying him. This giant, silent man with eyes full of sorrow. After a long pause, she spoke. "My name's Clara. That's Ruth, and little Annie." Elias grunted, nodding once. Clara bit her lip. "What should we call you, sir?" For a moment, he didn't answer. Then, his voice came rough, unused. "Elias." The name felt strange on his tongue after years of silence. But when Clara whispered it back, soft, grateful, it stirred something deep in his chest. Something warm. Something dangerous. That night, as the girls slept by the fire, Elias sat in the shadows, watching over them. His mind wrestled with ghosts of the past, the woman he lost, the vows he'd broken, the silence he'd chosen. But now, 3 hungry girls had knocked on his barn door, and nothing would ever be the same again. The dawn came pale and cold, spilling across the plains and breaking through the cracks of the ranch house shutters. Elias Boone was already awake, as he always was. For years, his mornings had been marked by silence. The scrape of boots across worn floors, the creak of leather tack, the steady breath of cattle. But this morning was different. This morning, he woke to the faint sound of laughter. Soft, girlish laughter, light as wind chimes, coming from the hearth where the fire had burned low. He stepped out of his room, pulling on his worn shirt, and found the 3 sisters huddled together. Annie, the youngest, was clapping her hands as Ruth tried to braid her hair with fingers too clumsy from hunger. Clara stood over them, her dark eyes alert, her back stiff as if bracing herself for his judgment. The girls quieted the moment they saw him, their laughter dying into nervous silence. Elias's chest tightened. He wasn't used to such sounds, not anymore. He wanted to hear them again. "You'll eat," he said, his voice low but certain. They looked at each other as though they hadn't expected more kindness. Elias ladled out hot porridge he'd made before dawn, setting bowls before them. The smell filled the cabin, and soon spoons clinked as the girls ate, their faces softening with relief. Clara, though, paused after a few bites. She set her spoon down and looked across the table at him. "Why are you doin' this, Mr. Elias?" she asked. He froze, his spoon halfway to his mouth. His gray eyes met hers, steady, sharp, unyielding, but beneath that stone she saw something else. "I don't know," he answered at last, his voice rough like gravel. Clara tilted her head, studying him. She was only 17, but loss had carved a woman's strength into her face. Elias shifted under her gaze, unsettled. The day stretched long. Ruth and Annie followed him to the barn, their curiosity brightening the dim place. They laughed at the cows, tiptoed past the chickens, and even dared to touch his massive draft horse, who had never tolerated another soul. The horse stood still beneath Ruth's tiny hand, and Elias found his throat tightening again. Clara lingered near the door, her arms crossed. She didn't trust easily. She was too used to men who looked at her with hunger or cruelty. But Elias Boone, he didn't look at her that way. His gaze was heavy, yes, but not unkind. Still, he was a mountain of a man, silent, broad, with a jaw that looked carved from stone. She told herself to be careful. And yet, when he helped Ruth lift a bucket she couldn't carry, or when he adjusted Annie's shawl against the wind, Clara felt something stir deep in her chest. That night, after the girls were asleep again, Clara stayed awake by the fire. Elias sat in his chair, sharpening his knife with steady strokes. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of wood. Finally, Clara broke it. "You don't talk much." Elias glanced at her, then back to his knife. "No need." She smiled faintly. "There's always need. Folks just forget how to listen." Her words struck him harder than he expected. He hadn't spoken to a woman in 2 decades. He hadn't let one sit across from him, firelight brushing her face, eyes filled with both challenge and softness. Clara leaned closer, lowering her voice so her sisters wouldn't wake. "Were you always alone, Mr. Elias?" His hand stilled on the knife. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, in a voice raw with memory, he answered, "No. Once I was gonna marry." Clara's breath caught. She hadn't expected him to share. "What happened?" she whispered. Elias's eyes were distant, storm-gray. "She died on the trail. Wagon overturned in a storm. Buried her by the cottonwoods. After that, words didn't matter much." The fire popped, filling the silence. Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to reach across, to take his rough, scarred hand in hers, but she held back. Instead, she whispered, "I'm sorry." Elias looked at her then, really looked. The flickering light caught her face, worn by hardship but still so full of fire. He hadn't let himself feel anything for 20 years. But tonight, sitting across from this girl who had knocked on his barn door, something in him shifted. Something dangerous. Something alive. Days passed, and the rhythm of the ranch changed. The girls brought laughter where silence had ruled. Annie's giggles followed him into the fields. Ruth's humming filled the barn. Clara, though cautious, began to speak to him more each evening, her voice weaving into his silence like thread into cloth. One afternoon, as he worked the fence line, Clara carried out a jug of water. She stood there watching him, shirt sleeves rolled, sweat glistening on muscles carved by years of labor. "Do you ever get lonely out here?" she asked, handing him the jug. He drank, the water running down his throat, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. His eyes met hers, steady. "I was," he said simply. Clara's lips parted, her breath caught. He'd said was, not am. Her heart thudded against her ribs, and she quickly looked away. That night, a storm rolled across the plains. The wind howled, rattling the shutters, and rain hammered the roof. Annie cried in her sleep, Ruth clung to her, and Clara sat awake by the fire, worry tightening her chest. When thunder cracked loud enough to shake the walls, she startled, and found Elias standing behind her. Without a word, he draped his heavy wool blanket over her shoulders. His hand lingered a moment too long, the warmth of his palm searing through the fabric. Clara looked up, meeting his eyes. For the first time, she didn't see just sorrow in them. She saw yearning. Her lips parted, but no words came. His gaze dropped, lingering a fraction of a heartbeat too long on her mouth, before he stepped back into the shadows. But Clara knew. The silent giant rancher was changing, and so was she.